Before you read another line, understand this. What you are about to hear is not just a prayer, it is a shift in attention. Because most people think money arrives through struggle, chasing, pressure. What if I told you that the real opening happens in stillness? And in the next few minutes, something in your focus will begin to change, not outside first, but inside. And that is where everything begins. What if the thing you call delay is not delay at all, but distance created by resistance you don't even notice? Because right now, you might believe money is something you are trying to reach, something far away, something outside your control. But pause for a moment and question that assumption. What if it is already moving toward you, but stopping at the edge of your inner resistance? But here's the truth. Most people never realize what resistance actually looks like. They imagine it as fear, doubt, or negativity. But in reality, it is much more subtle. It can look like overthinking. It can look like constant checking. It can look like mentally rehearsing how will it happen, even while trying to stay hopeful. And this is where everything shifts. Because if resistance is subtle, then so is release. And most people miss this part. They keep trying to attract abundance while unknowingly holding a tight grip on the very outcome they want to receive. It's like standing in front of a closed door, not realizing their own hand is still on the handle, pushing instead of allowing it to open. Now imagine this for a moment. What if money is not avoiding you, but simply responding to your internal signal, not your words, not your desires, but your state? And here's where it becomes even more interesting. A state of urgency sends one message. A state of desperation sends another. But a state of calm expectation sends something entirely different. And that difference is everything. Because life does not just respond to what you want, it responds to what you consistently are in your inner world. Now think about your recent moments of waiting, the checking, the hoping, the silent pressure in your mind when things don't move fast enough. You may have thought you were staying positive, but underneath, something was still leaning forward, still trying to force timing. But what if that very leaning forward is what keeps things just out of reach? This is where the hidden shift begins. Imagine for a moment that nothing is wrong, nothing is missing, nothing is blocked in the external world. Only one thing is happening. Your attention is either tightening around lack or loosening into allowance. And that small internal difference changes everything. Because the moment you loosen your grip, something in your experience also loosens, not instantly visible, but deeply real. And here's what most people never understand. Money does not only move toward effort. It moves toward alignment, toward openness, toward inner permission. Now ask yourself quietly, what would change if you stopped trying to pull it closer and instead stopped pushing it away? And don't rush the answer. Because this is not a mental question, it is a perceptual shift. And once that shift begins, something subtle happens. You start noticing opportunities you previously ignored. Conversations feel different. Ideas arrive without strain. Even timing begins to feel less harsh, less delayed, less uncertain. But here's the deeper layer. It was never the world resisting you. It was you interpreting distance as absence. And that interpretation shaped how you felt. And how you felt shaped what you noticed. And what you noticed shaped what you acted on. A silent loop, until now. Because in this moment, something new becomes possible. What if you are not being kept from money? What if you are simply learning how to stop pushing against it? And as that question settles inside you, don't rush to answer it with logic. Let it sit. Let it expand, because the moment you stop resisting the idea of receiving is often the moment things begin to move in ways you didn't expect, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The moment you stop chasing, something invisible begins moving in ways you cannot immediately see. Not because you gave up, not because you stopped caring, but because something inside you finally stopped pushing against the flow. And in that quiet shift, reality begins to rearrange itself. But here's the truth. Most people misunderstand what chasing actually is. They think it only means action, working harder, trying more, staying busy. But chasing is not just what you do with your hands. It is what you do with your mind. It is the constant mental leaning forward, the repeated checking, the silent question, when will it happen? The emotional urgency disguised as hope. And this is where everything shifts, because the universe, or life, or reality, whatever you call it, does not respond to pressure the way people think it does. It responds to coherence, to steadiness, to a state that is no longer split between desire and doubt. Most people miss this part. They believe more effort equals faster results. So they chase harder, think harder, try to force clarity out of uncertainty. But in doing so, they create internal noise so loud that they cannot hear the subtle openings already forming in front of them. Now imagine something different. Imagine for a moment that everything you want is already in motion toward you, but it can only arrive through a version of you that is not pulling, not grasping, not constantly reaching ahead of itself. What if the problem was never distance, but interference? And what if that interference is created by chasing itself? This is where something very subtle begins to happen. The moment you stop chasing, your attention returns. And when attention returns, awareness expands. And when awareness expands, you start noticing things you were too rushed to see before. A message that feels different, a timing that aligns unexpectedly, a thought that arrives without effort, not because reality changed, but because your relationship with it did. And here's what most people never realize. Chasing creates a tunnel vision. It makes you focus only on what is missing, what is delayed, what is not yet here. And that focus quietly trains your mind to ignore anything that does not match urgency. But when chasing stops, the tunnel opens, and suddenly, life is no longer narrow. It becomes spacious again. This is where everything shifts, because in that space, something invisible begins organizing your reality. Not in a magical explosion of instant change, but in a quiet restructuring, like pieces you didn't know were connected, slowly aligning themselves without force. And you don't notice it at first. You just feel a slight easing, a subtle mental silence, a moment where you are not obsessing over outcomes as intensely as before. And that is not emptiness, that is recalibration. Most people mistake this stage for nothing happening. So they go back to chasing, back to forcing, back to mentally pushing the outcome closer. But what if that pause, that stillness, was actually the beginning of movement? Think about it. When you are no longer constantly asking, where is it? Your mind becomes available to recognize it is already unfolding. And that recognition changes how you behave without effort. You stop over pursuing. You stop over explaining. You stop over controlling timelines. And in that state, life has room to respond in a way it couldn't before. Now imagine the future version of you looking back at this moment. You realize the things you once chased desperately started appearing only after you stopped tightening your grip on them, not because they ran away, but because you finally stopped standing in their way. And here is the quiet paradox. The moment you stop chasing is often the exact moment things begin to approach you, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a natural flow that feels like it was waiting for you all along. Not yet might not mean delay. It might mean something far more uncomfortable to accept. It might mean you are not being denied, but developed. And that changes everything about how you interpret your current life. Because right now, there is a good chance you are measuring your progress by external arrival, by visible proof, by something finally happening that confirms, yes, it is working. But what if the real process is happening in a place you cannot yet measure? But here's the truth. Most people collapse timing into meaning. They assume delay means rejection. They assume silence means absence. They assume distance means failure. But what if none of that is true? What if not yet is not a wall, but a corridor? And this is where everything shifts. Because a corridor is not empty, it is transitional. It is where you are no longer who you were, but not fully who you are becoming yet. Most people miss this part. They try to rush the corridor. They panic in it. They interpret it as being stuck. So they start forcing outcomes, adjusting strategies, overthinking every step, trying to break through a door that is not locked, just not aligned yet with their inner state. Now pause for a moment and consider something deeper. What if the thing you are waiting for requires a version of you that does not exist in your current patterns of thought? Not as punishment, but as alignment. Because imagine receiving something you are not internally prepared to hold. It would not feel like success. It would feel unstable, temporary, even overwhelming. And the mind, in its quiet intelligence, knows this. So instead of giving you something unstable, life begins shaping stability inside you first. But here's where it gets interesting. You may not recognize this shaping as progress, because it doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like repetition, sometimes like uncertainty, sometimes like standing still while everything inside you is being rearranged without your permission. And yet, that is exactly where transformation happens. This is where everything shifts. Because becoming is not loud. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like arrival. It feels like refinement, like subtle discomfort, like invisible rewiring of how you respond, how you think, how you hold expectation. Most people think they are waiting for money, opportunity, love, success. But what if what they are actually waiting for is internal compatibility with it? Think about your past desires. There were things you once wanted deeply, but if they had arrived earlier, you would not have known how to handle them. Not emotionally, not mentally, not even energetically. And somehow, they arrived later in a way that made more sense. That was not coincidence. That was development. Now imagine this applied to your current desire. What if the reason it has not fully arrived yet is not because it is far, but because a part of you is still learning how to hold it without fear, doubt, or collapse back into old patterns? And here is the subtle paradox. You are not just waiting for life to give you something. Life is also waiting for you to become someone steadier, someone less reactive, someone more certain even without external confirmation. And in that space between who you were and who you are becoming, there is often silence, not emptiness, preparation. But most people misinterpret preparation as delay. So they rush it, they fight it, they doubt it. And in doing so, they slow the very process they are trying to speed up. Now imagine a different possibility. What if instead of asking, why is it not here yet, you started asking, what is it building in me right now? That single shift changes your entire emotional relationship with time, because suddenly waiting is no longer passive. It becomes active transformation. And when you look back later, you may realize that what felt like delay was actually alignment in disguise. Not life holding something back from you, but life holding you forward into someone who can finally meet it without breaking. Abundance doesn't respond to effort the way you think. And if you've been trying harder, thinking longer, pushing more intensely, this might be the exact reason things still feel slightly out of reach. Because what if effort was never the real currency? What if something quieter, something almost invisible, has always been the real signal? But here's the truth. Most people have been trained to believe intensity equals results. Work more, think more, do more, push more. And somewhere in that conditioning, they begin to assume that life responds to pressure the same way a machine responds to force. But life is not mechanical. And this is where everything shifts, because abundance does not react to how loud your effort is. It responds to how steady your inner world feels while you are not seeing results yet. Most people miss this part. They think they are waiting on external conditions to change. More money, better timing, a breakthrough opportunity. But internally, they are broadcasting uncertainty, urgency, and emotional dependence on outcomes. And that signal, more than anything else, creates distance. Now imagine something different. What if abundance is not coming later, but responding in real time to your internal certainty? Not the kind of certainty you perform, not the kind you speak loudly to convince yourself, but the quiet kind, the kind that does not collapse just because nothing is happening yet. And that is where most people struggle, because silence tests belief more than struggle does. When nothing changes externally, the mind starts negotiating. It starts questioning. It starts replaying past failures and future fears like evidence against possibility. But here's the deeper layer. That mental noise is not just doubt, it is instability in perception. And abundance does not move toward instability, it moves toward coherence. This is where everything shifts. Imagine two people wanting the same outcome. One is constantly checking, worrying, adjusting, mentally chasing every sign. The other is calm, not because they see results, but because internally they are no longer arguing with possibility. On the outside, both may look the same for a while, but internally their signals are completely different, and over time, reality begins to reflect that difference. Now think about your own recent moments, the waiting, the hoping, the subtle pressure behind thoughts like, when will it happen? Or why hasn't it shown up yet? Most people believe those thoughts are harmless. But psychologically, they are not neutral. They create a background frequency of lack. And abundance, by its nature, cannot align with a constant signal of not enough yet. But here's what changes everything. The moment you shift from effort-driven energy to certainty-driven presence, something subtle begins to reorganize. You stop over-explaining your path. You stop over-checking outcomes. You stop emotionally collapsing every time timing feels unclear. And in that space, your perception opens. You start noticing things you previously dismissed. A conversation that suddenly makes sense. A small opportunity that feels different. A thought that arrives without pressure but carries direction. Not because reality changed instantly, but because your inner state stopped blocking what was already forming. And this is the part most people only understand in hindsight. Effort can move you, yes, but effort without inner certainty often feels like running in place emotionally, whereas quiet certainty, even in stillness, starts to feel like something is already arranged, even if not yet visible. Now imagine your future self looking back at this exact phase of life. You realize it wasn't the absence of effort that changed everything. It was the shift from trying to force outcomes to quietly knowing you are no longer out of alignment with them. And in that shift, something profound happens. Life stops feeling like something you are trying to catch and starts feeling like something that is already adjusting itself toward you. Not because you pushed harder, but because internally you finally stopped doubting what was already in motion. The biggest shift is not outside your life. It happens in a place no one else can see, not in your bank account, not in your circumstances, not even in your effort. It happens in a quiet internal switch, the moment you move from pursuing to receiving. And at first, this idea can feel almost too simple to matter. But here's the truth. Most people are trained to live in pursuit mode, always reaching, always adjusting, always trying to close the gap between where they are and where they think they should be. And in that constant reaching, they never notice they are emotionally positioned as lacking. And this is where everything shifts, because receiving mode is not about doing less. It is about becoming internally available for what is already trying to arrive. Most people miss this part. They think receiving is passive, like waiting, like hoping, like sitting back and doing nothing. But real receiving is not passive at all. It is a precise internal alignment where resistance drops and availability opens. Now imagine something subtle. What if life is already offering you things, but your current state is too busy, too tense, too mentally occupied to notice the openings? Not because they are hidden, but because your attention is locked in pursuit. And pursuit has a very narrow vision. It only sees what is missing. But here's where it gets interesting. The moment you switch into receiving mode, something strange begins to happen in your awareness. You stop scanning for what is wrong. You stop mentally chasing what is next. And for the first time in a long time, you start noticing what is already here trying to support you. A conversation feels different. A small opportunity suddenly feels meaningful. A thought arrives with clarity instead of pressure. Not because the world changed instantly, but because your internal position did. This is where everything shifts, because receiving mode is not an action. It is a state of permission, before for things to come without resistance, before for outcomes not to be forced, permission for timing not to be controlled. And most people never step into this state fully because they are afraid of what it means. If I stop chasing, will things stop moving? If I relax, will I lose progress? If I let go, will everything fall apart? But here's the deeper layer. Those fears assume that your effort is what holds everything together, and that assumption quietly keeps you in tension. Now imagine a different possibility. What if nothing you truly desire requires force to reach you? What if it only requires the absence of interference? And interference is not external, it is internal. It is the constant mental pressure, the emotional urgency, the subtle belief that if I don't stay on it, it won't happen. Most people miss how exhausting that state is, not just emotionally, but perceptually. Because when you are always in pursuit mode, you are not fully present for what is already unfolding. But in receiving mode, something softens, not your ambition, but your resistance. And in that softness, life starts to feel less like something you are fighting for, and more like something you are finally allowing. And here is what becomes almost unnoticeable at first. You begin to trust timing without needing proof. You begin to feel steadiness without needing confirmation. You begin to act without desperation. And those small internal shifts change everything in ways you do not immediately recognize. Now imagine your future self looking back at this phase. You realize the biggest turning points were not when you pushed harder, but when you stopped tightening your inner world around outcomes. Because the real shift was never outside your life. It was the moment you silently stepped out of pursuit and into receiving. And once that switch happens, life no longer feels like something you are chasing. It starts feeling like something that is finally meeting you halfway. And now, you can see it clearly, not as an idea anymore, but as a realization that settles deeper than words. Everything you heard in this journey was never about money alone. It was about the unseen relationship between your inner state and what life reflects back to you. The chasing, the waiting, the not yet, the effort, the certainty, the resistance, all of it was pointing to one silent truth. Nothing was ever separate from you. It was always responding to you. But here's the truth. Most people will hear this and still return to old patterns. Not because they don't understand, but because understanding is not the same as embodiment. They will still chase, still rush, still tighten their thoughts around outcomes. And this is where everything completes its circle, because the shift was never meant to be intellectual. It was meant to be lived in the quiet moments where you are no longer trying to force life to move, but allowing it to meet you to where you already are. Most people miss this part. They keep looking for a dramatic change outside, while the real transformation happens in the silence of how they relate to uncertainty, timing, and desire itself. Now you understand, but only a few will apply it, because application is not about doing more. It is about doing less of what creates resistance, less chasing, less overthinking, less emotional tightening around outcomes, and more quiet certainty in what you no longer need to prove. And here is the final realization. What you were calling delay was never absence. What you were calling distance was never separation. What you were calling waiting was never stagnation. It was alignment unfolding in a way your current awareness could not yet fully recognize. Now listen to this again, because the second time it will hit differently, not because the words change, but because you will. And when you do, you will notice something subtle begin to shift in how you move through your life. Less urgency, more trust, less chasing, more allowing, less noise, more clarity. And one day, without even realizing exactly when it happened, you will look back and see that the very thing you once tried so hard to reach began arriving the moment you stopped becoming someone who was running from their own present moment. And in that quiet understanding, nothing will feel the same again, because you will no longer be someone trying to receive life. You will become someone life naturally flows toward.